Now, Israeli officials say that they are increasing security screening of aid deliveries bound for Gaza to enable more supplies to enter the territory. The Kerem Shalom checkpoint will not reopen, but it will be used to check deliveries before they're sent through the Rafah border crossing that connects Egypt and Gaza. Two Egyptian security sources said inspections would begin on Tuesday under a new deal between Israel, Egypt and the United States. Our senior international correspondent, Fanny Fatshah, has more details.
We're talking about inspections and not to be confused with the Kerem Shalom crossing to be opened, which is closed since October 10th, actually. Before that, hundreds of trucks could get in and get out and deliver much needed aid, hundreds of trucks, I'm saying. And right now the situation is that the trucks can only get through the Rafah border crossing, but really a drop in the bucket in the current situation with the ongoing war. So having said that, an additional inspection, a facility basically there at the junction between Israel and Gaza and Egypt and Gaza may start there, an additional inspection that is much needed, and it's seen really as a ray of hope, because that would possibly mean to alleviate the pressure on with regard to traffic. There are really hundreds of trucks there miles away from the Rafah border crossing, and that would mean that more trucks could possibly get in. They still need to go through Rafah border crossing, but at least there's an additional inspection. And there are hundreds of thousands of people really in Gaza desperately waiting for food, for medicine, for shelter and for protection. In fact, the UN has already said that with the ongoing war, there's less and less supply available, which means that the trucks that are going in there risk of being attacked simply by desperate citizens. We have all seen those pictures of people trying to come through the rubble underneath a bakery store that was attacked, trying to get bread, parents skipping meals in order to make sure that the children are getting food. So the situation is really desperate. As a result, that crossing, even though it's not opening, but the fact that more inspection may be possible as a result is, as I say, a ray of hope to get at least a bit of more aid in.
That was our senior international correspondent, Fanny Fatshah, speaking to us earlier from Jerusalem. Now, the fighting in Gaza is being closely watched by Israel's Arab neighbours. Though relations with countries like Syria and Lebanon do remain hostile, there has been a long, slow thaw with other long-time foes, such as Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, Qatar has facilitated negotiations for the release of hostages and prisoners during the Israel-Hamas conflict. Let's take a look now at some of those breakthrough moments that show how things have been evolving in the region.
A simple handshake that speaks volumes. Israel's president and the Emir of Qatar at the COP28 climate summit, the first image ever to show the Emir with an Israeli official. While at the same moment in Gaza, the Qatar-brokered ceasefire collapsed and war started back up after 7 quiet days. Israel had been developing better relations with countries in the region, including the United Arab Emirates. And also Qatar, which is both a US and Hamas ally and has emerged as an effective negotiating partner, although it has no formal diplomatic ties with Israel. First, there was Egypt, Israel's neighbour to the south. The two have fought several bitter wars, but in 1979, with US mediation, signed a peace treaty, and Egypt became the first Arab country to recognise Israel's right to exist. It's one of Israel's most strategically vital allies, especially when it comes to Gaza. Egypt helps Israel enforce its blockade and coordinates on security. In 1994, Jordan, Israel's neighbour to the east, signed a peace treaty as well. In 2020, Israel signs agreements, also known as the Abraham Accords, with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with the blessing of the Middle East powerhouse Saudi Arabia. Those were later followed by normalisation agreements with Sudan and Morocco. The biggest win for Israel will be normalising relations with Saudi Arabia. The US has been encouraging the two to engage in talks. One benefit for the Saudis, as well as other Gulf states, is they would gain an ally against arch-rival Iran, one of Hamas's prime sponsors. Secret negotiations were reportedly going on, and then came Hamas's terror attack on October the 7th. Hamas described the impending Saudi-Israeli diplomatic agreement as one of its main reasons for the assault. Now, no matter how the war ends, it's difficult to see a path for Israel making major diplomatic progress in the region without some kind of a sustainable, long-term solution for the Palestinians.
And for more, I'm joined now by Ahmed Abouda, an associate fellow with the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa programme in London. Mr. Abouda, thanks so much for your time today. Has Israel's war with Hamas done irreparable damage to its diplomatic relationships with the Arab world?
I think we are living now the lowest level of any prospect of relationship between Israel and the Arab world since the Second Intifada. I think right now any talk between diplomatic rapprochement between Arab countries and Israel will be toxic and very explosive, given the gruesome pictures coming from Gaza with thousands of civilians are being killed, including women and children. But in the long term, I think the prospect still in the table. Saudi officials said that in the beginning, and I think this is the aim for those countries who normalize relations with Israel, including Bahrain, UAE, and Morocco, and even Saudi Arabia later.
Mm-hmm. You've spoken about the dilemma that Arab states face in having to balance showing support for the Palestinians with their own strategic interests. Could you explain to us what strategic benefits for Arab states a relationship with Israel offers?
So before the war, we had a reality where some governments in the Arab world saw some strategic value in normalizing their relations with Israel. And this had two dimensions. The first one is deterring Iran and balancing its influence all over the region. At a time, the United States has been seen as pivoting to Asia to contain the rise of China and focusing on the European theater, understandably, because of the war in Ukraine. The second dimension is this tranquility moment that the region was going through, and those governments wanted to build a new regional order based on infrastructure, connectivity, trade and economic integration, and high-tech cooperation, and even military high-tech cooperation with Israel. Now, the war in Gaza proved that bypassing the Palestinian question and normalizing relations with Israel without having the Palestinians on the table or even some kind of peace between Palestinians and Israel is not a recipe for regional stability. I think normalization now in the short term is seen as a very risky endeavor, and I think it became unattractive option for those countries who didn't normalize with Israel until now, including Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a moment to look at it the other way round. How valuable are regional relationships to Israel?
Well, Israel, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made it his ultimate strategic objective to expand Israel's outreach in the Arab world and to formalize relations with as many Arab countries as possible. And of course, making Saudi Arabia the ultimate goal, which in his view would open the Arab and Islamic world to Israel and end its isolation, sort of, on the Palestinian question by bypassing the Palestinian cause and not having to sit down with the Palestinian leadership to reach peaceful negotiations or peaceful resolution in the long term. And I think this would create great opportunities for Israel when it comes to security cooperation with these countries, which is going on in the secret, by the way, but not in public. And of course, expanding its economic footprint and technological footprint all over the Middle East. But it didn't work.
Among the countries that recently normalized ties with Israel is Bahrain as part of the Abraham Accords. In light of the war, Bahrain has severed those ties and recalled its ambassador. But Israel says that their relations are stable. You just mentioned the difference between what's going on in public and behind the scenes. I mean, can we see Bahrain's move as more, to prove its support of the Palestinians to the world than an actual diplomatic breakup?
I think Bahrain is in a more precarious situation. That is because in Bahrain there is a delicate power balance, domestic one, between the Shia and the Sunnis populations. I think we've seen that the Bahraini leadership is aware of the rising public anger. We have seen the lower chamber in the parliament in the beginning of the war announcing cutting off diplomatic relations with Israel, which has been walked back later and proved not to be true. But the Bahrainis have been adopting a low-profile position towards the Gaza war deliberately and not taking the front seat and focusing on not letting the war causing a widespread discontent in the street, and also not letting Iran, which has great influence from a Bahraini perspective on the Shia population, use the war in its own benefits.
I did want to mention Saudi Arabia, obviously very significant here. Riyadh has refused to condemn the Hamas attacks on October the 7th. Apparently, though, it's helped Israel by intercepting a missile from Yemen. Again, there seems to be this difference between what's being done publicly and what's going on behind the scenes.
I think we have to understand first what Saudi Arabia wants. Saudi Arabia wants to see a permanent ceasefire. It wants to see the humanitarian aid going into Gaza unimpeded. And in the longer term, it wants to see a peace resolution for this conflict on a two-state solution basis. At the same time, it wants to use the war to bolster its own regional leadership. And we have seen Saudi Arabia using its convening power in both the Arab and Islamic world. Now, Saudi Arabia has been adopting a balancing act that is appeasing the rising public anger in Saudi Arabia, which is very obvious on social media. But at the same time, it wanted to adopt a watered-down language to preserve its long-term interests, whether that is with Israel or the United States. So we have seen on one hand the Saudi leadership very aggressive towards Israel, even to the extent of demanding a weapon embargo imposed on Israel, but at the same time sticking to the status quo language of two-state solution based on the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been seen in some quarters as not compatible to the exceptional moment the Middle East is going through. And interestingly, recently, we have seen the Saudi official media upping the ante and being very aggressive in criticizing Hamas and accusing it of causing the agony and pain that the Palestinians in Gaza are going through now. So, to conclude, I think normalization for Saudi Arabia is still on the table, and I think in the long term, it has not been scrapped altogether.
We are almost out of time, but I do want to ask you, in general, what would you say the Arab and Gulf states see right now as a best possible outcome in this war in the longer term? I mean, is a two-state solution still on the table?
I think, first of all, the Arab countries do not want to see the Palestinians in Gaza being forcibly displaced into the Sinai Peninsula. I think they don't want to see any change in the boundaries of Gaza Strip, whether that is to create a buffer zone, as Benjamin Netanyahu has been demanding. In the longer term, I see the Arab countries are playing some role in reconstructing and financing the reconstruction of Gaza, but I do not see them wanting to play a central role in maintaining security in Gaza or running governance after the war. In the long term, I think they do want to see a two-state solution based on the Arab Peace Initiative or any kind of solution that the Israelis and Palestinians would agree on to be able to live peacefully side by side in the future.
Ahmed Aboudab from the International Affairs think tank Chatham House. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's cross over to our special correspondent, Aya Ibrahim in Jerusalem. Aya, Israel says that inspections will be stepped up at the Kerem Shalom crossings starting today. That's supposed to allow humanitarian supplies into Gaza faster. What kind of impact is that likely to have?
So they won't be stepped up, they'll actually be restarted. The Kerem Shalom crossing, which was actually prior to the war, responsible for about 60% of all goods coming in and out of the Gaza Strip has been closed completely since October 7th. And so far, for aid to go through the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt, it has to still be inspected by Israel, because even though Israel maintains it does not occupy the Gaza Strip and that it has withdrawn since 2005, it still maintains, according to the UN, effective security control. So nothing can go in the Strip without Israel's permission. And so the Kerem Shalom crossing will be open for inspection as an additional spot to inspect goods and be approved by Israel before they can then be routed to go in through Egypt. The impact, it will certainly, alleviate the bottleneck that has that is an aid groups say is now happening at Nitzana. But at the same time, we're again talking just about inspection. Israel still maintains that no aid will be coming directly from Israel into Gaza. And of course, there are the logistical challenges of distributing that aid, effectively having it be secure within the Gaza Strip, again, cannot be emphasized enough. One of the most densely populated spots on earth that's under bombing from air since 2 months, more than 2 months, and with an ongoing ground operation. 90% of the Gaza Strip's population has been displaced. Virtually everybody there is in desperate need of humanitarian aid. So the challenges still, will still continue, but at least there is that hope on the horizon with the inspection bottleneck, hopefully being slightly alleviated in the coming days.
How has this war in Gaza affected Israel's relationship with its Arab neighbors?
Well, let's start with its most immediate neighbors, the closest geographically, if you will. You have Egypt and you have Jordan, who have from the beginning been very vocal, calling for an end to the hostilities. And even though these are, the two, as the report points out, the two countries with the oldest peace treaties with Israel, any kind of talk of the mass displacement of Palestinians is highly alarming to the governments of both of these countries. And so there's a real sense by both Egypt and Jordan that there's an attempt by Israeli officials to displace the people of Gaza, and that they would be the ones that would have to shoulder the burden of that population. And so the governments of these two countries, even though strategic partners of Israel on a security level, and certainly to some extent on an economic level, have been very wary of this possibility and have pushed back explicitly against it. And then, of course, there are the Gulf countries, which are sort of newer to the peace treaty. Their peace treaties have come more recently in the past couple of years or so. And they, as with Qatar, have been trying. Qatar does not have a peace treaty, but it is, a Gulf country. The Gulf countries have been trying to play a mediating role to try and bring an end to this conflict. So, even though the Arab world is very diverse, different countries with different goals, there has been an attempt to at least to strike a balance between their strategic interests and, of course, the response that they're getting from their populations. And there, again, a very diverse region, different religions, different ethnicities. But I would say if there's one issue that is universally emotive across the Arab region, it's the Palestinian question. It's seen as a moral issue. It's seen as an issue of justice, and to a certain extent also, an issue of religious oppression, of course, because Muslims want Palestinians to have access to their holy sites here in Jerusalem as well, which have been under restriction by Israeli authorities over the past years. And there we've seen boycotts, attempts to boycott companies, efforts to boycott companies that are believed to, be connected to Israel or sponsor its government in any way. Anger that the region has, I would say, not seen in decades on the Palestinian question, which has been to a large extent sort of forgotten and sort of disappeared into the background, given the turmoil in the region, but is now back center stage and is politicizing a whole new generation of people in the region, getting them interested again in that question. And I think not doing Israel any favors to win hearts and minds in the region, something that the Israeli government has long wanted.
Thank you very much. That was our special correspondent, Ibrahim, in Jerusalem.